We're going to have a complete report on our special education.
Yes, if I may. Thank you, Mr. President. So, as the district knows, we've put a great deal of effort and energy and attention on remaking our special ed program and delivery system within the district for all the right reasons, and it's to take care of our kids. And we're very fortunate tonight to have extraordinary educators here who can describe to you what those efforts have been, and the journey that we've been on, and the challenges that we still have in front of us. And I'm pleased to give Dr. Schmitz an opportunity as an official employee of the district now to give her a chance to speak to the Board of Education as a member of our community. So, Dr. Schmitz, thank you to you for putting together this this plan for tonight. And if you wouldn't mind introducing your team members, and I will turn things over to you. So, thank you.
Thank you, and I really appreciate this opportunity. I was so pleased when I heard the request come in for a special education update. We have a lot of information to share with you. Can you hear me? Do I need to
A little bit closer.
make it closer? This is, okay, let's do that. Susan Downs, or as I like to refer to her as my right arm, is not here tonight, but she is trying to call in. So we're trying to get her hooked up because we want to make sure that we have her do her part of the presentation. I'm going to ask the teachers to introduce themselves as far as their names and the population that they typically teach and their buildings.
Good evening. I'm Rolanda Butler. I'm a special education teacher at Fillmore Elementary School, and I support students in grades K through 6.
Good evening, Heather Newton. I'm at Williams Intermediate. I am a instructional strat 1, so I'm currently teaching 7th and 8th graders this year.
Hello, I'm Sarah McGlynn. I'm nationally board certified special ed teacher. I teach at Monroe, and I have the opposite end of the spectrum, Little Bitties, K1-2.
Hi, my name is Kelly West. I teach at Walcott Elementary School. I teach in the moderate to severe disability program for K-6.
Great. We are so glad to have all of you included in our presentation tonight because they have done a great amount of work over the summer with Susan, and so we will be talking about that a little bit later. There are 3 objectives of this presentation, basically 3 parts. I'm going to be sharing some data with you for those board members who have been on the board for a while. It will be a review. For new board members, I think it will be new information, but I just wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page. We'll share future plans, and then we'll turn to the special education return to learn, which has been the work of these ladies. Before we start, I wanted to review how we got here. You can see that we go as far back as 2017. I'm going to be referring to that date in a couple of different slides. That is when the Department of Education first issued a caution letter to the district about special education, and then you can see how we evolved from that point. And so we're going to be starting with the data that caused the caution letter, and then we'll look at the data today. Because the citations at that time with phase 1 were around identification of students who require special education, lack of individualization, least restrictive environment, behavior removal. We're going to be talking about each of those. But we were disproportionate in all of those areas, and it really was a systemic noncompliance. And that was not understood initially by the district, because systemic means that, yes, they were referring specifically to special education students, or students with IEPs, I should say, but it was not about special education entirely, because general education is also a big part of a student with an IEP's education, because they are general education students first. And because we're in a committee of the whole here, I want this to be a discussion. And so please stop me at any time if you have questions. It's one of the reasons why I was more excited to do this at a committee of the whole rather than a formal board presentation, because I really want to be able to discuss with you any questions that you might have. So starting with the first one, identification. Identification is our obligation to identify students that need special education services. There are two criteria for that. First of all, they must have a disability. And second of all, that disability must lead to additional interventions or additional education services. It has to impact their general education progress. But anytime a student is identified as a student needing an IEP, they always remain a general education student. So anything that happens in general education continues to impact their progress and continue to be informed of their educational programs. So, yes.
Sorry, I'm going to be the first one to ask a
No, that's
question.
all right. That's okay.
I know back when I first started getting into this, there was some discussion over how students are identified as needing special education, and it had something to do with discrepancy versus
There-
diagnoses.
There was a discrepancy model in the past. Now it's more about the last bullet, so thank you for leading us to that. Mary, did we pass out the handouts? No, you're fine. We made a few changes to the PowerPoint, so we're going to give you some copies so that you can make notes along the way. We were planning to do this presentation a couple of different times, and as the longer I have, the longer I try and tweak the presentation. But before you suspect a disability, it used to be that we would just look at the discrepancy alone. Now, we look at how many interventions have been tried. We look at what was done through a robust multi-tier system of support. For kids with behavior, it would be positive behavior interventions and supports, all prior to even considering special education. What did their Tier 2 plan look like? What did their Tier 3 plan look like? How did they respond to different types of interventions, and what interventions were they resistant to? And so all of that is considered when you determine eligibility. And the last one up here is one that is particularly important for us because of our disproportionality, and that is that teams have to consider ecological factors. So that would include the student's exposure to reading, for example. It would include exposure to reading because of poverty. Any one of a number of things. It would consider whether the students, whether English is spoken in the home. So all of those sorts of things. So it's a package deal. It's not the old model where we would just look at the test score here as opposed to peers.
Okay.
So one of the things that we're doing within the special education department now is we are becoming very data-driven. And so we try not to make decisions without data. Now, it's because we haven't been data-driven necessarily in the past. In some cases, we're data poor, but in many cases, we're data rich. It's a matter of using it. So one of the first slides I want to show you is our student demographics. And the reason why this is important is because when we look at disproportionality, we always go back to this slide. So for example, if 53% of our students are Caucasian, then we would expect that 53% to be in most categories that we look at. Same with our students of color. So I would ask you, and that's one of the reasons why you have the slides in front of you, is because to refer back to the district demographics, and you'll see that we have shifted some over the last 3 years as we look at other data. So given that, and then we look at the demographic data of students with IEPs. Now, one of the things that you'll notice with this slide is our students who are African American are overrepresented because we do not have 28% of our students in the district overall as African American. They're actually at 28% now. And our Hispanic population and 2 or more races has stayed relatively stable. It's our white and black populations that have shifted. But Overall, the last 3 years, the percentage of students with IEPs by race has not changed significantly. Now, when you look at those slides, you're going to say all three are exactly the same. But we do have, we see some changes in the data. It's just that it is too minuscule yet to be able to show in percentages because we have so many students. Does that make sense? I mean, it's like a matter of 50 kids is not going to change the overall percentage because of the number. So that's identification. We're about the same, but we're making some progress. We are, the other thing about identification is that our partners at the Area Education Agency, Mississippi Bend, actually by law in Iowa have responsibility for child find, which is what we call identification. And so they are critical partners for us. And we have been doing some joint planning and professional development with them, in particular to make sure that we look at what happened prior to looking at a student needing special education in MTSS, PBIS, and ecological factors. Yes. It's okay.
Sorry. So let's say we have a child who comes into the district in kindergarten or first grade or whatever, and the parent says, my child has been diagnosed with, I don't know, autism spectrum disorder, and these are the things that this child needs, or my child has been diagnosed with dyslexia. Do we then take that diagnosis? Do we have an obligation to evaluate the child ourselves as a district? Can you tell me a little bit about how that works?
It would depend on the quality of the data that the student comes with.
Okay.
If we have very little to work with because for whatever reasons, we may do another evaluation.
Okay.
If the student comes and it's very rich and it's recent and it's current, we may do very little. So it really just kind of depends on the documentation that they arrive with.
Okay. And then, so we also know that there are plenty of children who would never have had a chance to be evaluated before they end up with us. So one of the things I guess I was cognizant of and wanted to make sure we sort of were doing properly is making sure we identify kids as early as possible.
Yes.
So is that part of this training that we've been doing with the AEA and things like that to improve that process?
It is, and it goes back to making sure that we are considering all of those bullets.
Okay.
Because there's a danger in waiting too long, but there's also a danger in pulling the trigger too soon.
Okay.
Because we all know that research over the years has shown us that once in special ed, always in special ed. And we're getting better at releasing students when they're able to go back into the general education environment entirely. But there's some caution on both ends of that. Okay. So it's making sure that that we pay attention to all of the different pieces outside of just only special education. The ideal thing would be that if a student is released from special education, they would go back into general education with a Tier 3 intervention plan under MTSS.
Okay.
And so MTSS and special education need to speak to each other constantly, and they're actually, in some parts, one and the same.
Okay.
All righty. Least restrictive environment. It means the amount of time a student with an IEP receives instruction with their typical peers or in general education. The goal is to have every student in general education, and quite honestly, that is the most likely scenario. One of the things that people often misunderstand about students with IEPs is that we have a very wide continuum of need with students with IEPs, the majority of whom have relatively less need and should be in general education for the majority of the time. But that does not mean that we don't have kids with very significant needs, because we do. And for kids with very significant needs, their least restrictive environment might be never going into a general education classroom. So it needs to be extremely individualized so that we can determine what is the least restrictive environment for each individual student as an individual. So that we are not categorizing a subgroup as needing the exact same education as other kids that would be in that subgroup. For example, you mentioned kids on the autism spectrum. It's called a spectrum for a reason.
Yeah.
Because there is a very wide spectrum as far as needs within autism. And so we would never say that a child on the autism spectrum needs this classroom because they all do, but rather would look at each individual as far as where they fall on that spectrum. Same thing with kids who were born with Down syndrome. We would never say that this is our Down syndrome room, which is what we actually used to do quite a lot of years ago across education in general, is that we categorize kids with disabilities according to the type of disability rather than looking at them as individuals, which we must do. So the reason why I'm sharing this, we have to report to the federal government on LRE every year in 3 categories. The percentage of students, or the number of students with IEPs that are in general education 80% more of the time, those that are in general education 40 to 79% of the time, and then those that are in less than 40% of the time, meaning they are removed for more than 60% of the time. The reason why I wanted to point this out to you is because for the board members who have been here a while, they will remember that the Department of Education came to one of your board meetings on October 30th in 2018 and presented this slide. You remember that I said that there was a cautionary letter that was sent to the district in 2017 in the spring. I just described to you 80% or more, 40 to 79, less than 40%. You can see at the green line through 14, 15, and 16, those that were in general education less than 40% of the time with their non-disabled peers were the highest majority, or were the highest percentage of our kids with IEPs. So the orange line is that middle category, and the blue line is the category, what I was describing to you, where most of our kids fall, which is being in general education 80% or more of the time. But they were the lowest percentage of our kids with IEPs. So it was exactly the opposite of what it needed to be. So the cautionary letter came, and look what happens to the blue line. And that's what really set this all off, is that the cautionary letter came and we said, whoops, we got to change that. And so there was an overcorrection as far as needing to change our percentages in those 3 categories. So as I said, the spike is what started our intense relationship with the Department of Education, because we have enough kids in Davenport to where you would never see that spike if it happened naturally. But rather it happened through a directive from the administration. And so that is why we got to where we're at.
And I remember asking questions about this at the time. So these numbers are just reporting numbers. It's just data that the government collects. They are not benchmarks. Is that correct?
That's right.
And that's kind of what happened. Is
That's
they
right.
were
That's
perceived
right.
as okay.
Yes. And so they're collected every year. But you can see what we did. Not only did we spike in the number of kids that were in 80% or more of the day, but we also took a downturn of those kids that are out for less than 40%. So anybody that would be looking at this would say, okay, something happened. And so that's what started with our visit. Now, let's look at our more current LRE data. We have corrected that. We now have the majority of our kids with IEPs in 80% or more of their time with their non-disabled peers. We have our middle group, and then we have the less than 40%. But let me tell you what I'm concerned about when I look at this slide, is that we corrected. What I'm concerned is, can we sustain it? Because look at the trend. We're starting to go kind of into the middle again. And so that's going to be part of our work that I'll be talking to you about, as far as not only, we have corrected the noncompliance. We did that through all of those student citations that we needed to correct. Once we corrected all of those student citations, we were considered to have noncompliance corrected. It's sustaining it that we need to be careful about. So this is that most intensive group who are in general education less than 40% of the day by race. And you will see that in 1819 and 1920, we still have a significant number of kids who are African American that are pulled out into the most restrictive setting. And compared again to that overall demographic data that I shared with you at the beginning. So we continue to see the same message that we need to be paying attention to here. So removals, the citation originally was in-school suspensions and out-of-school suspension, and also restraints. So this was another slide that was shared with the board on October 30th in 2018. The risk of Black students with IEPs receiving out-of-school suspensions for disciplinary reasons, students who are African American were 6.66 times more likely to receive an out-of-school suspension, 10 days or less, greater than 10 days, and then they were 2.04 times more likely to receive an out-of-school suspension for 10 days or less. First one being greater than 10 days, second one being less than. And then they also showed us that removals for suspension and expulsion, the top is Davenport and the bottom is the state of Iowa. So we were 3.76 times higher compared to the state when it came to removals of our students who are African American with IEPs. So let's look at it today. 1819, 1920. You can see that we still have a lot of work to do in this category. This is 10 plus days out of school suspension for all students. We're not just talking about students with IEPs here, but for all students. You can see that our African American students represent the largest majority of students who are suspended for 10 days or more, and that total continues from one year into another as far as trends. And 5+ days out of school suspension for all students. Again, we have students who are African American that are overrepresented there. So we have some work to do, obviously, in that area. And we've made some great goals and actions towards that. One thing that I want you to understand is that when you're given, when you have a district with such a large population, it's hard to see changes in data unless you get to a more granular level. So one of the things that we're doing is looking at building level data so that we can address individual buildings that are having concerns about this or having struggles with this, because to move the masses in a percentage is difficult to see, which is why in the data I shared with you as far as our IEP identification or students with disabilities identification, it looks exactly the same for 3 years. We've had some changes, but the data are too granular yet to be able to show it in the larger percentages.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What year did we inaccurately report our suspensions? Simply a office referral became a suspension?
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up, because these data, and someone who was here at that time may be able to speak to it more accurately than I can, but we have data quality issues as far as making sure that each building are reporting things correctly and going by the same guidelines. We've been cleaning that up as well, and so thank you so much for bringing that up, because you have to consider that when you look at this, as far as were the changes due to better data quality, or were they due to actual numbers of kids that were removed and the number of times. I don't know if somebody wants to speak to when that all came down, but I know we were dealing with that when I first got here in the spring of 2018.
Well, I know I had the opportunity to have that discussion last year when we went back and changed the model. So when I first arrived last year, the rule that everyone was following, because they believed that was the rule, that any student that was removed from a classroom for 5 minutes, that became an out of class suspension. And what I was hearing from the principals is they were spending an inordinate amount of time at the end of the day just coding all of these, period by period suspensions for the students who maybe they were pulled out in the hallway for 5 minutes and they just had a conversation with the principal. But let's say it went to 6 minutes, all of a sudden now for that period, what I was told is that that's what they were told to do. So I'm trying to be careful. This inaccuracy in the data wasn't because of any recalcitrance on our part. It was us trying to follow the rules that we were told to. And once we realized, I think it was about October of last year, that our suspensions were just spiking up tremendously, it made sense to me to say, well, this 5-minute rule, I've never seen that. And that's when we had a conversation with the DE, and we received the memo from Amy Williamson that basically altered that to give us that 30-minute window, essentially, so that when a kid is removed from class, there's an opportunity to get back in at the end of the period. So it actually went to 40 minutes, which meant that if a student was removed, went to the office, as long as they got back to their next period or they came back at the end of that period, it was no longer a suspension. So last year's data, I'll just be honest with you, and we ran into this in a lot of the work that we did last year. So we had to course correct in November because the rules changed from 5 minutes to a longer period of time. And at least that was my experience. Now, how that all began and where that started with the 5-minute rule, that predates my arrival. But I do know that we had to have that conversation with the DE last year because we were seeing that spike in reporting.
So our 18, 19 numbers really aren't accurate because they probably didn't go back and correct them. Is that safe to say, or?
That would depend on when that 5-minute rule began, and I would have to defer to my colleagues who were here prior to my arrival if they remember when that messaging, sounds like Rob is going to come up and give us a hand with that.
I think part of it is, and this is a natural tendency, and I think that it's something that we need to be aware of, is that we've had a tendency to overcorrect. And so we see a spike here, and so then we overcorrect so that it goes down. But understanding, rather than understanding perhaps, that systems change takes time. And especially when you're dealing with the numbers that we have, it would be unrealistic that we would suddenly see massive changes in data from one year to the next.
Yeah, we did change. It would be the 18-19 data would reflect most of those removals. But again, when I look at this data, this is more about percentages. And so if it was the same rule for every kid in our district, it still shows our disproportionality because every kid was getting the same treatment. So it still shows how our numbers are out of whack. So when I see that, that's really what I see in the data.
Thank you, Rob. That's a really good point. Everybody would have been erring, and so as a percentage.
Yeah.
One more data, or one more thing about disproportionality. You can see our seclusion and restraint data for the last 2 years. Seclusion is confining a student's room or enclosure to restrict their egress, trying to leave. And restraint is the application of physical force that reduces or restricts the ability of a student to move their arms, legs, or head freely. And again, you can see that we are disproportionate in that area as well. So we're going to talk about how we're going to be dealing with some of that in just a moment, but I wanted to take you back. Susan, are you on?
I am.
Okay, I'm going to, can you see the slides?
I can. There's a little bit of a delay with what I'm watching, but I think we'll be okay.
Okay, I asked Susan to do these slides because she's the one that stood before you every board meeting for 2 years talking about these pie charts. And so I'm going to let her gloat a little bit. It's phase one, student.
So we're on the one for phase 1 and the discussion of compensatory ed. Am I correct, Sandy?
Yes.
Okay. So as you recall, during that year at that November state board meeting, there was some concern by the DE and then the state board that we weren't making enough movement on securing comp ed teachers to provide the compensatory ed to the students that we owed it to. And so that's when we created a contract with AEA, and they helped us secure teachers. And we were also then able to pay our teachers at a little bit higher rate, which also helped us secure some teachers. During the year, I then reported at every regular board meeting the number of students that were determined owed comp ed based on IEP meeting discussions around these citations. So just as a reminder, we had 2,866 individual citations or students that we needed to meet on, some that had already graduated, some that didn't even live in our district anymore, but we had to meet on all of those and determine which, if any, because of the non-compliance, that we might have owed compensatory ed. In the end, we ended up owing 315 students compensatory ed. And at the end of that school year, the 2018-19 school year, we had closed out 257 of those, meaning that we had provided the comp ed according to what the IEP teams had determined. We had 54 students who were continuing to receive compensatory ed, and then we had 4 students that we had yet to schedule due to needing to locate them because they weren't within the district. As of July of this school year, you can see that we have closed out 303 of those students that we owed comp ed to. We currently have 11 students who are receiving compensatory ed, and of those 11, the majority will be receiving compensatory ed at least over the next couple of years. I think many of you remember when we showed the hours owed of compensatory ed, there were a small number of students who the IEP teams had determined we owed thousands of hours of compensatory ed, which would take us several years in order to get it accomplished. And so the 11 that are currently receiving comp ed, the majority of them have several hundred hours yet to provide, and so we will be providing it over the next 3 to 4 years. There is one student that we still need to schedule. We were having trouble locating that student. The individual is currently incarcerated, has expressed an interest in receiving compensatory ed, and we are working with that institution to determine how we can deliver it.
I'm really proud of
But
you.
this gives you an idea of where we are right now.
Okay, Susan, we'll go to the next
So-
slide. Phase 2.
Yep, the next slide. So the next slide, then during our phase 2 visit, there were some additional citations. And the first one were for students who were possibly inappropriately placed on alternative assessment. So alternate assessment are for our students who have very significant disabilities, and they are instructed on what we call the essential elements, which are tied to Iowa Core, but are modified in order to meet those students' needs. And then we, instead of assessing them using the Iowa assessments, the standardized assessments, we use what's called alternate assessment, which is provided, again, by the state of Iowa. And we're actually in a consortium with multiple states for that. So there were 170 students that we needed to reevaluate. And of those 170, we found a number of students who should not have been on alternate assessment, and should not have been instructed on the essential elements, but should have been receiving their instruction in the general ed core. And then of those students, we had 43 that were determined that we owed compensatory ed, and honestly, that compensatory ed would really address those general ed standards that we had not been instructing them on. And of those, 13 are closed out. We've provided those services, or the parents declined. And we currently have 30 students who are in the process of receiving that compensatory ed. And I would anticipate the majority of those will be closed out sometime this year, knowing that there are a few students in that group who also were awarded several hundred hours that will take a number of years to provide. And then Sandy, if you can go to the next slide.
Yeah, Susan, I just wanted to say that we met the timelines in phase 2 to evaluate all of those kids.
Yes, we did. We met the timelines in all of them.
Right. If we hadn't, the red need scheduled would have numbers in it, but since it's 0, we were able to meet the requirement of the citation. Now it's providing the comp ed services. So I have the next one up, Susan.
Yeah.
Phase 2 early childhood.
You bet. So we also, there were a number of students that during the phase 2 visit, when they did their case study reviews, that they felt we had served in too restrictive of a program. So Sandy shared with you the requirement that we consider providing services to students in the least restrictive environment, or educating them with their general ed peers to the maximum extent appropriate for that student. And the state, when they came in and did their case study, found that there were some students that they believed sorry guys, that's my dog. Found some students that they believed would have, maybe we served in a self-contained program in early childhood that actually belonged in a lesser restrictive setting, such as the general ed environment, with services provided there. And there were 168 students that they had us review. And of those, we owed compensatory ed to 19 students. 16 are currently receiving, and 3 we've closed out. And again, I anticipate that we will probably close out the majority of those within this year. In the case of the early childhood students that were found to need compensatory ed, most of the parents asked that we provide those services in the summer rather than during the school year. So we provided many of those services and are still providing this summer.
All right. Thank you, Susan. So in
bet.
summary, but as far as this part, the accomplishments, we have met all of our corrective actions in the area of individual students and in the areas of professional development. We began to, some of these habits had occurred over time, and so we needed to really start working on mindsets, but I have to tell you that teachers have been outstanding and building principals have been wonderful to work with, as far as understanding that we needed to stop and back up and restart. And so while the data don't show yet that we've made much progress, I'm convinced that we will be continuing to show better data in the future. But again, this is systemic work, and we need to recognize that as far as we're trying to move a very large mass, a very large N size, into showing our changes in the student data, and that's going to take time to even be able to show. If you would like to see some more granular data, we'd be happy to share that with you at any time. But our continued work is obviously disproportionality. We still have a great amount of work to do in that area. As I described to you in the beginning of this, part of this success of making sure that the right kids are in special education for the right reasons is that we have a very robust and effective MTSS, PBIS system. Breaking down the silos through collaboration. We've done, I think, a pretty remarkable job with that. When I first got here, special education was in another building. And it was just difficult to collaborate. I mean, a meeting was a big deal, trying to get people to be able to commute back and forth. We're all one family here now, and I think that we're doing a much, much better job of collaborating throughout special education, title, general education, all of our colleagues. Fidelity of implementation, I want to take just a moment. We've done a lot of professional development over the last 2 years, but it's been to the masses. And you can see that when that happens, we continue to find noncompliance. Now, special education is a very difficult law, and it's a very heavily prescribed law. So it's not likely that you would ever walk into a building and start to look through all of the paperwork that it's going to be 100% compliant. And we're like every other district in the country when it comes to that. But it's to make sure that we don't continue to see the spikes and some of the reoccurring problems that we have. So instead of doing professional development to the masses, we're going to take some of the professional development that we've done and really work with buildings as far as checking their fidelity of implementation, and then coaching and modeling and reinforcing as we need to do that. As a matter of fact, the professional development that we've done this summer and last spring, we gave teachers the fidelity of implementation checklist that we'll be using. So they have it, they know what we're going to be looking for, but not in an evaluative way or not in a compliance way at all. It's really meant to find teachers or administrators that are struggling, and what sort of modeling can we do, what sort of coaching can we do, and then to reinforce the good practices that we see. Yes.
So what are some of the examples, some of the things that are on that checklist of what you're looking for?
A simple example is one of the things that we've struggled with is there is a form that parents are supposed to leave with after every IEP meeting, and it's called a prior written notice. Doesn't matter what it's called. But what it is it's, and these teachers can speak to it better than I can, but it's like a cheat sheet so that when parents get home, they can look at, because they've been given so much paperwork, parents can look at it and it tells them the decision that was made, why it was made, why other ideas were rejected, and kind of is the cheat sheet for the whole conversation. There are certain areas of that form that must be filled out per law, and we have struggled with, it's been in our citations as far as filling it out accurately. So one of the things that we'll be doing is having, which is bringing me to my next point, we're really building more system support at the building level. And so we have special education facilitators. They've existed in the intermediate schools and the high schools for the last couple of years. We put them into elementary schools this year. We've added 4 so that they're not quite so spread thin. But using that as an example, they'll be looking through their teachers' prior written notices. And if they see a teacher that is continuing to struggle, they would sit down with that teacher. They would go through the process again, provide them with whatever support they need.
How often are you checking those things, I guess? Is it like after every IEP meeting, or maybe you give them a couple, because obviously you learn something every time you do something. So
Right. Susan, you can remind me how we did that last year, but the idea is that we would get this whole list of stuff that we want to work on with teachers as far as fidelity. And then some may be after every IEP meeting, some might be quarterly, some might be monthly, depending on how often that particular type of data is collected. Does that make sense?
right, and so through that data, I mean, you can probably pinpoint it if it's a problem in a particular building,
Right.
and then maybe it's whoever is coaching that person isn't doing the best job of coaching it, so then we can figure that out
That's
too
right.
at the same time. Okay.
That's right. Yeah, we would really do more of a root cause analysis. So let's use your example, that the coach wasn't properly prepped to be able to provide coaching. We would talk to the teacher and say, you're still struggling, and he or she might say, but that's what I was told to do, and here's the directions that I was given. So then you kind of backtrack to find out where you need to kind of shore things up.
Okay. So there is checks and balances.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
And I know that when we first started talking about fidelity of implementation, it made some teachers very nervous because they thought, maybe it was my role at the time, I'm not sure, but they thought it was going to be evaluative. and that it was all about compliance. That is not the case here at all.
I guess I do have one other question. Do you find, I mean, I guess it's probably too early to ask that, but are a lot of the teachers and the coaches pretty receptive to this? I mean, obviously it's a new learning thing because we weren't doing it for
Right.
so long.
Right.
So you're going to have hiccups along the way. I just want to make sure after everything that's happened that we're on the right path.
Right,
and
right. I do too. I think that, you know, we're still getting teachers used to the idea. And part of getting teachers used to the idea is working through their principals. And working through groups of teachers. And, but I think that, and these ladies can probably tell you better than I can, as far as how it's being, received now. But I think once we go through, and we can demonstrate our coaching and we can demonstrate our modeling, and not only that, but I would really like to find out some of the really best practices that we have and videotape those and have those be models for other teachers.
You keep making me think of more questions. Is this done like by the building and not to the masses, like you said before? So now it's like building specific. You're sitting down with your team in that building, so you kind of have a little more of a comfort level, and
Yeah.
you can have, I guess, an open discussion on how you're doing things and how it's. Is that how it's done?
It will depend. That's how we're going to start. But if we find that we're finding a lot of buildings have problems with that particular thing, whatever it is, and then we look at our district data and we're not seeing progress in the district data, then we may have to do something with the masses again. So it really kind of depends, but our sit and get with 100 teachers in the room, the data tell us that's not working. And so we need to get into classrooms and support teachers and model what we're talking about, follow up with our training so that they feel as though they have the support to be able to implement what they've been trained on.
And not only that, I guess they probably feel like it's a little more collaborative when it's.
Oh, sure, I
smaller,
hope so,
when you
yeah.
have a little more input versus like right now we're having a pretty good discussion.
Right.
If there was like 100, 200 of us in the room, it would be a little bit harder to.
Right.
No,
Right.
I appreciate all that, and I apologize every time you were saying something.
No,
it's
that's
making me
all right.
think of something else. So.
As a matter of fact, Susan and I have been looking at how our roles will evolve throughout this year as well. And I don't like to do anything without Susan, but Susan will be in the buildings a lot supporting those facilitators and really helping them with their role of coaching and modeling. And so we're trying to tier it up, so to speak, so that we make sure that we've got levels of support at many levels. And we'll be working very closely with the principals as well.
Last question, I promise on
That's
this.
right.
So when you get this stuff implemented, would it be okay for one of us board members that kind of wants to see the process to come along
Sure.
and kind of see how the whole process works? Because, I mean, I got to sit in an IEP meeting before, and it was as something I'd never done. So,
Right.
I mean, it was nice because then when you're talking about things, then I kind of know what you're talking
Right.
about because I got to actually see it. But I think it would be informative for us, especially with the phase two and everything like that. I mean, as a board member, especially as the vice president of the board, I want you to know I have a vested interest in this and
Right.
anything I can do to help.
And I think that Dr. Kobilski can talk about how we might do that. But I think with the agreement of the teacher and the principal and all of the parties, I wouldn't want a teacher to suddenly be coached and have a board member walk in.
Right.
But I think that we can certainly describe the process. Perhaps we can videotape some of the processes and bring them to you. Because this is what all of the research will tell you is the most important thing in systemic change. And that is coaching and modeling and moving a system forward. So I'm really excited about it. I think that we will be able to see better movement quicker this way.
Thank you.
That brought up one of my questions. So I actually had hoped to see an IEP meeting at some point too, and I was invited by a family once, but I never, it didn't work in my schedule. So if you guys are able to provide us a window into some of these processes, that would be, I think, really helpful. So do we have a way of getting feedback from the parents right now? Because I know that was another big part of our issues. And, sitting in an IEP meeting, you don't want to be asking for feedback there because that's not really conducive to honest feedback. So
Right.
do we have some processes in place for that as well so that parents know or have a way to say, this is what I expected, it wasn't what I expected, I felt listened to, I didn't, that kind of thing.
Yeah. We're going to be developing ways to engage parents for exactly that reason at the building level. It's a little more intimidating, and maybe we haven't done it as effectively as we should have. But I think parents are more receptive to when their building invites it, rather than perhaps the district. And I'm sure that there are parents that would do it either way. But so it's really bringing that relationship back to the building, and within the teacher and the student and the family as a whole. But we need to calibrate that in some way so that we're really able to show that we've made gains in that area. Please.
I will put out the invitation now, and I know that you and I kind of regularly have communicated over the summer, but I sit on the end at the very initial onset of a student's journey in special education. So it might be beneficial for you to attend one of our meetings because then you would be able to see, as Sandy's talking about, when we're sitting down and looking at, here's all of the things that we tried in special ed, and this was kind of working, this wasn't working, this worked a little bit, and now we need to add to that. But that's not really possible to do within the general education without this additional supports and kind of how we all communicate as a family. That won't happen, of course. Well, it won't happen in a typical way, no matter what. But when that process starts to happen, because again, as we're saying, we don't want to place anybody who inappropriately or who shouldn't be. So it takes a little bit of time to run through all of those systems. So if they're not working on tier 1 and then tier 2 and 3, so it's usually not until even really the semester that starts to happen. But when that process starts to happen, then I'll just reach out to you. And if, obviously with the approval of everybody else, I'm sure that everybody wouldn't mind having you sit in. So I'll keep in touch.
Thanks.
And just to piggyback with the facilitators in the building, that has really been an asset to us as teachers because prior to that, if we had questions about something, just trying to contact somebody and waiting for an email back. So to have that person in the building has just really been a plus for us. And what we do at our building is we plan a meeting every other week with our facilitators. So whatever information that she's getting from her meetings, she can pass it down to us. And if we have any questions, that person is right there in the building where we can go and schedule for her. But not only with stuff with IEP, if we need resources for students, maybe something's not working for that student, that person is there to help us with those resources and providing that to us. So that has been an asset for us in our building. So
Awesome. That's good to hear.
Having been in the classroom 32 years, I've been through this whole process. I've sat through good IEP meetings and frustrating IEP meetings because of directives that came to the teachers and said, this is all you're going to give them. So it was never an individualized. So I've been
That's right.
through a little of all of this. My question is, how long, and when I was teaching, it wasn't called MTSS, but it was tier 1, tier 2, tier 3.
Right.
How long would you expect that with fidelity, you truly did the tier 1, the tier 2, the tier 3? Would it come to a point where you would say, yes, we agree this student needs to be evaluated for special ed services?
Yeah, and one of the things that's a really good question because one of the things where the country really got into trouble when we were first doing response to intervention, MTSS as it's now called, was to try and say, okay, everybody must get 6 weeks or everybody must get 4 weeks. It's really based upon the data that team needs for that individual child. And then as professionals, they know we've tried everything, or we haven't tried this, or we need to talk to this person, or and so it's impossible to say how much time because every student's situation would be so different. What has your guys' experience been?
I would agree. It would kind of depend on the severity of the need. So if a student is, again, we don't want to allow them to crash and burn for longer than a week or two at a time. So typically, in special ed, if we've gone for 2 to 3 weeks and we're progress monitoring them and we're not seeing an increase in or a decrease in the skill, depending on, if we're not seeing a change in the direction that we want, then we stop, we evaluate what we're doing, and then we move forward. So we kind of are doing this, a similar system within the general education setting. So if after several weeks that kiddo is just not, is still on the struggle bus and still on the struggle bus, still, then we're going to move faster and not wait the full 6 weeks or 30 days or whatever it is. It's much more individualized.
And who's making that decision? The
whole-
district or AEA staff? Because that's, again, where I ran
know.
into issues with, I'll just be real. I had 2 students who went through 3rd grade. At the end, they said, oh, sorry, we ran out of time. First thing in 4th grade, they'll be tested. Yeah, that didn't happen.
Right.
Based on AEA saying it couldn't be tested, and I had to jump
Yeah.
those hoops all over again. So, like, I don't want to see outside people. I want to see people in the building, district people, teachers in the classroom having a bigger share of that than some outside group coming in and saying, here's what you need to do.
You're exactly right. And that really, when we started to do that, whether it was from an outside group or whether it was from this office,
Correct.
is when the train derailed.
Right?
And so we just have to make sure that we have teams with the appropriate people on them, with the appropriate data in front of them to be able to make these decisions. And that was the whole reason for the lack of individualization, because you're exactly right.
But I think an important piece, if I could just jump in for a second, and Karen, you bring up a very good point. We couldn't just say, all right, now this is your responsibility, good luck. So that's why you're seeing all of the work that this team is doing in terms of mentoring the teachers so that they can take on that responsibility at the building level and do it right and do what they need to do for the students, because for too long, they have not had that opportunity. So I really appreciate the fact that our teachers have their elbow coach
Right.
that we know is
Yes.
far more effective than the, sticking 90 people in a room and going through a PD presentation. That's why we have math coaches and literacy coaches, because that we know is where the power of really developing our pedagogy comes from. And what we hear from our teachers is these facilitators are making a big difference in terms of helping them work through issues and develop that knowledge base so that we can have that on-site decision-making authority take place.
And exactly, it needs to be at the site, in the building, with the teachers who are involved.
I
So I'm
totally
glad to
agree.
hear that's
Yep, I totally
where we're
agree.
at.
And we had not only taken the decision-making away from the teachers, we had taken it away from the building principals. And so they were no longer instructional leaders when it came to students with IEPs. And so when we told them, okay, you can be, they were like, oh, but wait a minute. Tell me again. Because people had lost skills during that time. And so that's part of the building of the system, and I know that the data doesn't reflect it, but we have to build people's skills again so that they can make the proper decisions that they need to.
Sorry, one last question before we move on to the next section.
Yes.
So I'm going to go back to the original slide that sort of started everything off, where we went all of a sudden to having 80% of our kids, or a ton of our kids. So is the goal, when we looked at the next slide, you said the numbers were, the lines are similar to what we saw in 2017, right? So there was this decision made that we're going to take all of these kids and put them in general education. I mean, essentially that's what it was. And
Right.
Is the reason, so I would have expected to see it go back a little bit towards the middle the following year.
Are you talking about this slide in particular?
Yeah, so 2018, it looks very similar. So is the goal now, or the idea now, that those students are spending more time in general education, but it's because we have the supports that they need in that general education classroom. that
Exactly.
They can be there.
Exactly. So we
Okay.
need to make sure that the supports are there. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that we want to have hard percentages on any of these.
Okay.
What we need to be able to ensure, because we have students and families in Davenport that struggle. So our percentages may, for very good reasons, look different than another district.
Okay.
And so what we need to be confident of is that teams are making the right decisions with the right data. And then the percentages will be whatever they're meant to be. But we need to make sure that we're not, as Director Klein-Jerome said, not dictating from this office what the percentages need to be.
Okay, so that's kind of just what I wanted to clarify, because I want to make sure that we're making these decisions based on what the kids need
Exactly.
and not what somebody else
No,
says.
we're not, we have no targets
Okay.
as far as, it's just that due to the typical nature of education and types of disabilities, because most kids with disabilities who have an IEP, normal intelligence, it's just that they have a reading deficit or a math deficit. And so those kids that are very significantly involved are not the highest percentage. So we should always expect to see that the higher percentage of our students with IEPs would be in general education 80% or more of the day. But there are no targets about that. That would be bad.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to hear somebody say that.
Yeah.
That comes from the central office.
I appreciate the question. I appreciate the question. Yeah.
I guess I kind of have a question for each one of you.
Oh, perfect. I'm so glad they're
And
here.
a few of you have talked. How do you feel that this process is working? Obviously, you were probably around with previous marching orders and the way you were doing things. I'm trying to be a little bit correct here.
You get it.
Versus how it is now. And I mean, each of you are in different buildings, different parts of town, rural areas, and you're in different grade levels. So how is it working in your building? If each one of you can go and kind of give us an idea on that, if you don't mind. I'm going to start right here if you would like.
How is it working in my building?
Be honest.
From prior, it's more centered on the student and the student needs, and just providing them the support that they need. And if they benefit from being in the gen ed setting, we try to have them in there as much as we can, but to also provide them that individualized, that specially designed instruction that they need. So I hope that answers your question. From like prior to what it was,
Right.
I feel like now we are more focused on, in tuned on the student and the student needs.
I guess my second part to that would be, do you feel it's more collaborative now? Are you getting more participation with the teachers in the building as well that are part of this? Because I know previously that wasn't happening and it was... Yeah.
Yes, we are, because myself, I am on a grade level CTT, and we try to align with the students that we provide services to, and that way we are able to support them with those gen ed standards as well as with their IEP goals. So that does work better. And if we have students that are cross grade level, we always try to have it where we have a SPED teacher, at least on one of the CTTs for grade levels. So then when we meet every other week, we talk about what they're working on, so how we can provide and support those students when we meet with them also.
Thank you.
So I've been in this district for 13 years doing the same job. And prior to this change in mindset, it was a program instead of services. So we kind of had, the resource model, we had life skills, we had BD. And now we provide services to our students. It's a little more student focused right now, and we're not primarily looking at what program does this kid fit into. And it's definitely been a mind shift change of how we look at each student. I do agree with Rolanda. It's more focused on the students themselves and not what program does this kid fit into. It's not like a box. this box, this box, and this box. So it's a definite mind shift center that we're looking at and how we change our mindset when we look at each kid. Collaboration is a definite shift that we've done now. I do sit on a CTT now, so it's nice to be able to contribute to that, you know, in my position of what I do. So it's a definite change in that mindset that we have with our kids. We're not looking at that program. It's that service that we provide to the kids. So each IEP is actually individualized now. Not that it technically wasn't before, but when we get the IEP coming in, it's this kid, oh, this is a BD kid, this is a life skills kid, this is a resource kid, and now it's what services do we provide this student, what are the goals for this kid? So it's definitely more of a service and not what program does this kid fit into at this point. And that's just at the intermediate level. And that's the way it is, I think, for all of our kids now.
I'm glad that we got to answer this question because that was really bothering me with Karen's because I've had that exact same experience. This is year 16 for me, but I've taught Gen Ed and SPED, and I've taught in other districts as well. And part of the reason I did that was because I got really disheartened by the system, and I didn't feel like we were doing what was right or just for our kids. And I left and came back because I could see the change and I could see that there was something better. I genuinely look for, this is awkward and you have to recognize that we're all a little wacky in this profession anyway, but I love having these IEP meetings now because we're starting and at Monroe, we're very trauma, I don't feel like it's just more about trauma-informed care is a very kind of at the center of all the things that we're doing. So we're starting all of our meetings, and especially in like this time of crisis, of like just how are you? Are you guys okay? What do you need? Are you fed? Do you have? Before we're making sure all of your basic needs are met, and that we have aligned you with the services that you need prior to even talking about what education supports that you need, because I can't teach you anything if you're hungry or if you don't have any clothing or if you're food insecure, which those of you who know me, I'll go right down that like crazy food insecurity train with the pantry work, but that's crucial. That's so I love going to these meetings, and especially now, and we'll talk about it a little more later, but it is genuinely looking at like every single thing that kid needs, and maybe being outside at recess or those unstructured times is too much, and that's okay. That's okay. If you're too dysregulated after you come in from recess, then let's have recess in a different way. And maybe your recess is in my room or in like you get to bring your friend or whatever your preferred activities are. That we can think much more outside the box, which is how I felt like it used to be. And then as we know, we course corrected way in the wrong way. And it's really nice to feel like we all have that autonomy back, and that we have the support of not just our CTT meetings, which I think are super crucial. We have SPED ones and Gen Ed ones that I sit on, but also at the building level, they're doing those in our SIT meetings. And so we can see every week, this kiddo is, behavior hasn't gotten any better, or academically this is working or this intervention's not. And so they're not sitting in one intervention for 8 weeks with no progress happening, or they're not like, do you know what I mean? Like things are not just laying stagnant. Back in the days where we had like A, B, C, D, and they would be on that one for 30 days and then it was 45 and other things. I remember. And so it's not that anymore. If they need that 30 days and it's working, rad, then what we did was the right choice. If not, then now I feel like we have ways to speed that up, and it is very much centered on our conversations with our whole grade level team and special ed team. Hope that answers your question.
Hi. There we go. I would definitely say that it's a
microphone a little closer.
Yeah. I would say that overall there has been so much, I've had so many valuable conversations with parents and teachers and SPED teachers that from the shift to, it's the IEP team's choice and all of the decisions that you make is based on the student, has definitely allowed teachers to be like, hey, this is what's going on. I'm kind of stuck here. What are your thoughts, or what have you done? And so that we can kind of piece together what's worked, what we know instructionally and maybe behaviorally that have had some success in other situations. And then the facilitators also have been very helpful as well.
You can send me questions anytime. I feel like we need to move into the next phase. Yes?
Once you empower the building and the building IEP teams, along with the principal, to be basically the sole decision makers, how do you maintain any control of your budget? Because I remember in the past, one of the issues we used to have was parents and others on the team deciding that a kid needed a para, or the kid needed this device or that device, or the kid needed, he needed more time here and more time here, and
Right.
and
Right.
I'm sure you've all run into very savvy parents who enjoy expanding the services their child gets because they think the child needs this.
Yeah, and one of the things that, I was in classrooms the first year I was here where there were more adults in the room than kids. And so in some cases, I believe that we did perhaps overuse the notion of having paras assigned to certain kids. But what we have to go back to again is, for some kids, it's the perfect service, and for some kids, it's not. And so it's not all or none for every single student. And so if teams are given the proper guidance and tools to make good decisions, then all of that works out. Because we have weighted dollars for these students, and those dollars are intended to be used to whatever they need to support their deficits. And for some kids, that's a para, for some kids, that's this. But it's that we have the right data to make those decisions on an individual basis.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Sandy, because that's what I was going to add. We're trying to take as much subjectivity out of this and having data rule the day. So when those parents are making those requests, we're going to look at the data and what they suggest.
Yep. Yep. And I've had to have difficult conversations with parents as far as you're asking for the Cadillac. And this will meet your child's needs. But we have to be able to show them that through progress that their child is making. And we can't just be throwing darts at the dartboard. When I said in the beginning that we are becoming data-driven, that is, there are no truer words that were ever said, not only for individual students, but for buildings, but for districts, but for professional development. So it's going to come out in the wash, however it's going to come out, if they're using the right data to make individual decisions.
So we won't have a deficit in the special ed budget?
Oh, I'm not going to say that.
I like that
As a ma-
analogy. If a Hyundai can get you from point A to point B, you don't need
But
the Cadillac.
As a matter of fact, this might be another conversation for another time. It makes me more nervous if a district doesn't have a deficit, if they've got a lot of money left over, than if they've got a little bit of a deficit. In special ed.
We have never had that problem.
In special ed only. If it's okay, I'm going to turn this over to Susan and her team, because they have done a lot of work and I have hogged all the time. So Susan, I've got the summer of Return to Learn up. Did you follow?
Okay. Yep. I'm ready to go. So we are excited to kind of talk a little bit about the return to work, learn work that we did this summer and how it's guiding what our IEP teams do this year. As you guys are aware, because we presented this, the Return to Learn team presented earlier in the year, that we needed to have a plan to the DE by July 1st that addressed these areas. And special education, though it is addressed under all of the areas, there were some specific actions we needed to develop under the area of equity. So Sandy, if you can go to the next slide.
Got it?
Okay. So under Return to Learn, there were 3 models of learning that our district developed a plan for. There's the on-site learning, which honestly is basically the traditional 100% in the building, face-to-face learning, what we've done for the last 100 years. And why we had to have a plan for that was that the kids were coming, that we needed to do some recovery of what had been lost during the time that we were in voluntary status last spring. We needed to make sure we had procedures in place to ensure everybody's health and safety, and then how we were going to ensure, again, IEP services were put in place. Then we also came up with the hybrid model, which you're familiar with. That's the now 3 days on, 2 days off, 1 week, and then the following week, 2 days on, 3 days off, or online. And then we also had online learning. So if the district were to shut down or parents were to choose, we would provide instruction via 100% online. And so IEP teams, currently, the current IEP that we have in place for our students actually addresses the traditional 100% on-site learning. We don't need to do anything to the IEP in terms of when kids return face-to-face 100% of the time, because we already have that developed. But what we do need to do is develop plans to address hybrid and online learning. And so that is what the guidance that our R2L team plus the Department of Ed provided, so that IEP teams could meet prior to the start of the school year to have a plan in place for our students under both the hybrid and online learning. And if we'll go to the next slide, our team is going to start to present a little bit of the thinking around what we came up with.
So as you can
I think, Sarah, you're next.
So as you can see, special education, so our equity committee is covering not just special ed, but they were responsible for plans for ELL, our English language learners, TAG, and all of our at-risk students as well. So there's a lot. And so what ended up happening is then you have like a subcommittee for your subcommittee. And so there was a lot of committee meetings about committee meetings. And so we were in, as part of the equity group, we were responsible for just the special education actions. And then we would come together later and kind of at the beginning and the end to make sure that the initiatives or the action items that we felt were crucial were not also being addressed by ELL or by TAG, and so that everybody, we weren't creating redundancies.
I think that's neat. So the why was, why must we develop hybrid and virtual learning plans? This was going to be able to, for us to be able to be proactive and provide movement between the different instructional models. So as we look, we have to think that if the data says that we need to be hybrid, or the data says that we need to be 100% online, just looking at it because it could be fluid, what we had to do, we have to have models in place to support our students. Because we might have to transition from one site to a plan to another plan. So what we wanted to make sure was that our parents understood what we had to do, but not only our parents, but our teachers did. Because when we left in March, we had no idea of what was going to happen. In the last 8 weeks of school, we were like, oh my goodness, we was all worried about like our students. How are we going to provide them the support that they need? We have students that's very discrepant from other peers. Like we might, for instance, for myself, I have a student that was in 5th grade but was reading at a 2nd grade level. How am I going to provide that student the support that she needs? And I'm not face to face with her. We contacted parents to make sure that they had Chromebooks or do the best we could to support them. But right now we wanted to make sure that we had plans in place that we could provide our students the support that they need, whether we were hybrid, 100%. We were not worried about being face-to-face. We know that we could do that face-to-face, but just making sure that we could provide them the services that they need and the support that they need, whether we were hybrid or 100% online. And we wanted to make sure that our teachers understood what they had to do and that we had a plan in place. But not only that, our parents, making sure that our parents was up to date to what they could help us as we try to support their students. So that was the whole why of it, so we could be prepared for it. And that's what we worked on in our committees to make sure that we have a plan in place, whether we were hybrid or whether we were 100% online.
Very good.
So, as part of the plan that we created together as the R2L team, we talked with Susan and everybody and determined that these IEP meetings needed to happen as soon as possible so that everybody, parents, teachers, so that we're all on the same page and they can have as much information about what to expect as possible to help them have some sense of normalcy in this time of uncertainty. So we had three 2-hour trainings where we presented, the R2L team presented to the SPED teachers in our district and administrators and everybody that needed to know this information was there. And they're also online on our SPED website so that if a teacher missed it for whatever reason, they can go back and get all the information that they need. And we have been holding meetings since August 3rd and even through the storm this past last week. I know that my building completed at least 10 IEPs mid-storm, so I'm sure that all the other school districts did something as well. It's really been a great experience seeing our families again and having these meetings and letting them know how much we want to support them and we're going to be there to support them and their students. We are also, the special education department is also paying teachers and everybody who are a part of these meetings to attend and prepare and write this additional to their IEPs.
Yeah, last week when buildings didn't have electricity, we were getting calls, but we have IEP meetings.
How many students are from special ed going to be online 100% versus hybrid? Do we know?
We are still shaking that out a little bit, but as of today, it was about 23% of the kids with IEPs.
Online.
Yes. Online, yeah. And so, so that's where it is right now.
So 23% of all of the children with IEPs have chosen online 100%.
Yes.
Okay.
At this time, yes.
And of the 3,400 or whatever who have chosen online, how many does that translate to? Is that like half of those students?
Of the 34, how many are?
Of the 3,400 who have chosen online,
You
how
know,
many?
I don't have that exactly, but when I heard it, and it's fluctuated a little bit within the last couple of days. But given that our special education percentage of students within overall is higher than what it should be, it's about 18-19% the last time I looked. We would be a little bit above that, I believe, as far as the percentage.
Okay.
But
So maybe
I'm-
20% or something of the people who've chosen online.
Yeah,
are
I'm
students
not
who-
overly concerned about it yet.
Okay.
I think it's more about we're starting to analyze it according to buildings.
Okay.
And level of need.
Yeah.
Who has this slide?
I'll talk about it. I'll fill in awkward silence any day. Okay, so our virtual hybrid plans. So what we had talked about as a team is that it might be possible or may happen where on a Thursday we get word that things are spiked and, you know, the walls have fallen off or whatever. And by that next Monday, we need to be going 100% online. So it would be crazy for us to then in 24 hours try to be holding all of these meetings again. And so when we're having these meetings now, whether or not a family has chosen to go 100% online or not, we're creating both a hybrid plan and a virtual learning plan because we also want to allow them the flexibility of when they get home If that's not working for whatever reason, we want them to know that we'd welcome them back and that we already have a plan for that. And so when we're creating those plans, these 6 things are the topics that we're covering every time. So they're, again, Gen Ed for kids first. And so we talk about here's what's going to be expected of them if they go 100% virtual, or if they're in a hybrid plan, this is what would happen during the school day. And then their IEP is exactly like it would normally be on the days they'd be in person. If not, on the days that they'd be home. Let's talk about like what needs does that kiddo have? Is it really going to be feasible for them to sit down for 2 hours straight and work on that? Or do we need to have that? Maybe we do chunk that up and they do part in the morning and part in the afternoon. And additional needs might be like, so for my little people to have like a checklist that says, okay, I need, these are, it's kind of like my to-do list for the day. And then once I've got that done, I can check it off. And then maybe parents can choose to reward that behavior if that's something that's a struggle. And then that's just another way for us to monitor progress as well. And but there might be a kiddo who needs to log on and just to have the support because maybe parents are working or they're in a daycare situation where they don't have another grown-up available to help them. Would it be possible to have a para come in then for those 30 minutes if maybe they had, like a lot of my people would, not a lot, few have support for when they have individual work time that helps keep them on task and it helps to regulate their frustration. And so if they're getting to that independent work time online, maybe that para can log into the same group or they have their own little Google Classroom hangout and they can do it that way. And so looking at all of those different supports and services, and again, every single kid, I had 3 IEPs just today and none of them were at all like the other. And so again, that might be possible. For example, if we have a little who's only got behavior goals and they're going to be 100% online, it just might not be possible for us to monitor that her level of engagement or her ability to control her frustration and manage that in a socially appropriate way. That might be difficult for us to do because the setting is completely different and they're maybe not being asked to do non-preferred things. So then we make a decision in a line at that time, marking it, that documenting that in our IEP, where if they're 100% virtual, then we won't be progress monitoring that goal. And we'll wait till that human is back in front of our faces again, and then we'll pick it up from there. And then additional considerations, some that have come up for us have been maybe there's a new anxiety diagnosis, or maybe there's a food insecurity issue. Currently, there's an issue kind of with the therapists that have been within the building, our school-based therapy programs, have hit a bit of a snafu. And so it's a kiddo who might have had online or had time face-to-face with a therapist, trying to make sure that we would have that need met as soon as possible too. So we're really looking at all of these different things, what that would look like in a hybrid situation, and then what that would look like if they were completely at home.
And one thing I want to say too about that is we looked at the student, what that student needs, because I've had a couple of meetings and what we look at is, does that child need more? If they chose hybrid, would that child need more time? So what we look at is maybe that child maybe need to come on those off days. So maybe that child needs to come maybe Tuesday and Thursday as well, but maybe not the full day, but maybe he or she needs to come maybe 4 hours or maybe 2 hours, just depending on their minutes and the support that they may need. It might be that they need to stay for lunch and then go home after lunch. Maybe they need to just go before lunch because lunch might look a little bit different. We don't want to cause any other behaviors or anxiety for that child. So again, we're looking at the individual child and what that child may need. So.
So were there some guiding questions and considerations for each of those 6 prompts that Sarah just went through? 2 sources for those questions and prompts. One was the Department of Education guidance that they put out, and the other, and along with that, was the Area Education Agency's Procedurals Manual. And then, of course, from those 2 areas, we got the Return to Learn Special Education Committee that we came up with some additional suggestions. And those suggestions that we came up with was based on the families that we work with on a daily basis, because we tend to know those families and those students that we work with, because we work with them pretty frequently, and you know, we're kind of on a first name basis with them. These questions that we came up with from the Return to Learn Special Education Committee Are questions that, as we discussed at the meetings, are by no means, a comprehensive list of questions to be asked as we're working with those students and those parents at those individual IEP meetings that we're having. They are just a starting point for the IEP team to have a very rich conversation with those families, because again, those parents know those kids better than we do, because they've had them since March 13th of last year. And they've learned very quickly what it's like to be in our shoes as teachers. And they've learned some quirks and some things about their kids that we may not see. So we want to know from their perspective what's going to help them if they have chosen online, what's going to make them more successful working at home and online, that we want to put into those plans to make them successful. And again, those questions and considerations are meant to help that IEP team think creatively and outside of that box, again, to make that child as successful as possible for that IEP. Because we're not changing the existing current IEP in that system. The hybrid and the virtual online learning plans are just being added to the existing current IEP. Now, there have been occasions where we might have to amend the current IEP depending on the conversation that we're having with the parents, but that has been few and far between from what I've heard, or at least in my experience with working with the parents. But we're just adding to the current IEP. So again, these questions and considerations that we've come up with are just a starting point for the team to have that rich discussion with the parents. And from what I had with my meetings, I could probably speak for my panel here too, is that it's been a really good conversations that we're having with our parents, because we're getting to know more about our kids and our families. So it's just a really good point and a starting point to have those rich conversations with our parents and our families, to start to know how we're going to start this year off, because it's been a crazy year and a crazy end to our last year. So we want to have that really good plan in place for our students when they do come back to us.
Susan?
Yep. So then the basic point or the bottom line of this is as we hold these IEP meetings with our families, there are multiple sources of information. We want to find out from our students things that they feel that would work best for them. Parents, and Heather talked about, our parents know best what happened during that online time or during that voluntary time last spring, and what things seem to work best for their students. But again, then gathering from our staff in the building, and then the suggestions from the R2L committee as well as the DE, and looking at it as a puzzle, and that we're putting together based on each student's individual needs in order to make sure we have the best plan in place for our students, knowing that we may have to adjust it in the future as we learn, because we're going to learn as we go. Next slide, Sandy. One of the things that we are providing to our teachers is we created a special education Google site, which is located on our Teach website, and then a resource we have for Return to Learn. And at there's a link to it, but we won't go to it now, but anybody can access it. It really does, it has the Department of Ed guidance around returning to learn, along with Department of Ed, links to Department of Ed guidance around just regular IEP development and other considerations. There the resources that were developed by the Special Education R2L committee are on there, along with recordings of the training sessions. And just, I don't know if this was because I was having trouble getting in at the very beginning, the four panelists that you have, along with Amy Wint, who was not able to make it, joined me in training our teachers when we did those 2-hour sessions a couple of weeks ago. And so they were part of providing the training. And we recorded those sessions so that anybody who did not have a chance to view them or participate, or anybody who wanted to review them later can, and those are located on the site, along with many other resources for our special ed teachers, and we will continue to update that site as we get new information. Okay.
So,
and the next one's Heather.
So prior to school starting on September 8th now, wrong dates up there. Prior to school starting, so basically beginning August 3rd, the IEP case managers started calling parents to schedule the IEP meetings, and develop, which means we start developing those hybrid and virtual plans. These meetings are still ongoing, and documentation is key in any development of any IEP that we have, whether it's now in August or anytime throughout the school year. So we are still working on documenting those plans in our IMS system, And parents always, always, always receive a copy of any IEP plan that we make for our students. That way they always have a copy of whatever we've done. As Sandy had alluded to earlier, at the IEP meeting, they should get a copy of that prior written notice, but in these plans, they will get a copy of those hybrid and virtual plans that we create. After the school year starts, we will begin implementing those plans, whenever the school year starts. Hopefully it is September 8th. And then we will monitor that student participation in the Google Classrooms if they're online. And we'll monitor their progress within the school building for the hybrid. We will monitor their data of their goals that we have, and then we will take that data and review it as we do in any IEP goal that they have. And then the team will convene and look at that data. And if we have to adjust those hybrid plans, then we will obviously adjust and reconvene that team if we need to, and make any adjustments to those plans if we need to do that at that time. And that's pretty much it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank these ladies. Please, they've done a lot of work.
Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you all for all the hard work and for being here tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thanks,
for answering
Susan.
my question too after putting you on the spot. Everybody knows I preach strategic plans. You guys have hit pretty much everything. You have your benchmarks on how you're going to measure things, and if it's not working, what you're going to do to fix the plan, and plan the work and work the plan. So I greatly appreciate that. I think we're going to be doing special ed updates about every month, so we'll definitely be able to do this more. But I greatly appreciate you guys giving us almost 2 hours. So
A little more than what they bargained for, but that's okay.
Well, and we certainly appreciate the opportunity to showcase the changes that are taking place, not only from a district perspective, but obviously from a special ed department. And we're able to do that because of the quality of individuals that we have working within the system. So ladies, thank you so much for representing your colleagues so well this evening. And I'm hoping the board, one of the takeaways from this evening and from the conversation is the change in culture and climate of the district. What we've learned with organizational research is that successful organizations have what's called a loose, tight philosophy of how they operate. We're very tight on our value system. We're very tight on our expectations. We're very tight on the goals that we set as an organization. But for us to be successful, we have to give autonomy to the people that are doing the work in the trenches. And we can't do all the work at the central office. And we got away from that a little bit a few years back. And I think the shift in that philosophy of relying on people like this to do the work that needs to be done, Director Paustian mentioned it with regard to DSAT, how he's seen it. You've all seen it in the committee work that you've done. We have extraordinary educators in this system. And for the first time in a while, they're getting an opportunity to show us what they can do. And I couldn't be more proud of the work that they're doing. And I hope that our parents take comfort in the level of quality of leadership that we have amongst our colleagues here. So ladies, again, thank you for your representation. Sandy and Susan, thank you so much for your leadership in this department, pointing us in the right direction, keeping us on track. And thank you to the Board of Education for allowing us the opportunity to get on this track, because it wasn't a given. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, but it's okay. You guys can start.
Okay, we'll start.
Actually, I'm only going to be 5 minutes, so if you
okay,
could
I
just
can
hold tight.
We'll now go with the introduction of the Strategic Teaching and Learning Plan.
So what brought up this topic were comments from board members that have occurred over the course of the last few months. We've heard about the need to have a strategic plan, which I think we all agree with that. I heard a question from one of the directors is, do we have a school improvement plan? I think I remember you asking that question. So let me start by saying, yes, we have a school improvement plan. It's called a teaching and learning plan, and it's linked into board docs this evening. And that was a plan that was approved by the Board of Education in 2016. Some of you may remember that process. What's disappointing about all of that is we haven't referred to that in the time that I've been here, and I don't know how often you've had conversations over the teaching and learning plan in the years prior to that. So for us to move forward effectively, we have to make a decision, and I think we need an entire workshop just devoted to this particular topic. We're not going to cover it in the next 10 minutes, I can assure you that. But I wanted you to take a look at what was deemed important in the eyes of the Board of Education when they approved this plan in 2016. Our task moving forward is, and again, just as a reminder, what a strategic plan is supposed to do is to identify where we are right now as a system, but where do we want to be in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years? What is that vision of the future? So a strategic plan always begins with an analysis of where we are, but where do we want to be? What do we want to be known for? What do we want to look different? What is that point in the future that we admire, that we want to be as a system? And that visioning exercise is very important to strategic planning. Now, as you probably saw, if you looked at the link that I provided to you today, and Mary, thank you for putting that in there, it had an end date of 2021, which means we're coming up on the end of that. So from my perspective, as a new superintendent who's been here for a year now and has a pretty good understanding of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that we have as a system, I think it would be valuable for us to begin starting that where are we now conversation that would transition into a community-wide effort that really helps us paint a picture of where we want to be in the future. That's not a board-level decision. That's not a superintendent's decision. That's typically a community process where we get multiple constituents together and we work on that vision of the future. My recommendation to the board is that we sit down at some point in the very near future and start carving out a process like that. What I would say is keep in mind that the world has changed a lot for this district in particular since 2016. You know, we just had evidence of that this evening for the last 2 hours in terms of the presentations. We know what's happened with the SBRC in our budget. Throw in, you know, the citations that we're under right now, that in a way, those are all tactical pieces as well as trying to manage the COVID virus. So we've been operating very tactically in the 1 year that I've been here, and we need to start transitioning that into a strategic piece. The problem is finding the time for all of this work that's taking place. We are living in unusual times. You'll see on Monday night that we have a report that's due to the Department of Education every single month. The board needs to approve that report on Monday. That's taking a great deal of our time to, you know, put together. The entire team has been working on that this week, in addition to Return to Learn, in addition to all the elements associated with our Return to Learn plans. So my request of the board is that we carve out a workshop and develop a plan, but we have to develop a process that is task manageable, knowing that I have to get the school year started. And we have to get it off to a successful start. And September 8th is where we're going to go. And let's make sure our Return to Learn pieces, whether it's the IEPs are all done and T's are crossed and I's are dotted. Let's get the school year off to a good start. And once we get that going, let's sit down as an organization, as a leadership team, and start mapping out a process that will allow us to build a strategic plan that is viable and is useful. I think one of the things you'll find with your plan, and I don't disagree with any of the goals that are in the plan. I think they're, you know, all of them are laudatory, but the question is, are those the same goals we have now that were identified in 2016? The answer may be yes, and we can continue some of those pieces, but the answer may be no. There may be a shift in value system of where we need to go as an organization, but those are very intense, thoughtful, encompassing conversations that don't just happen in a board meeting or two. But I think we need to have that conversation, but realizing that we need a couple months to get our feet on the ground to start this school year. So I would just ask the board to review the document from 2016, knowing that I think the intent was very clear, and I'm not disagreeing with anything that's in it, but the fact that it became a document that for whatever reason just seemed to sit on the shelf. That's not what strategic plans are designed to do either. We need to have benchmarks along the way associated with each of the performance indicators. And the conversation that we just had this evening with special ed, those are strategic conversations that we should have on an ongoing basis. How are we doing in this particular goal that we set for ourselves? And one of the things you'll notice in the particular document, there's really no way to tell how we're doing.
Yeah.
I don't know if you noticed that, but I think that's the glaring weakness of that. I think the intent was noble and they're good goals, but there was no accountability for how we're doing. And here we are coming up on the 5-year mark, and I don't think we can answer the question of if we've met any of those goals, right? Which is not the intent of a strategic plan. So I suggest that we circle back and not spend a lot of time analyzing the data from that strategic plan. I think we need to take a look at where we are right now as a system and then work with our community to identify our value system. And then let's put together a vision for the future of where we want to be in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, and 10 years. And then to start develop those goals. And once we develop those goals, put in the benchmarks so that every quarter, every semester, theoretically, we can get together and have a conversation like we had tonight and go over those goals and see how we're doing. So those are just my thoughts and my recommendations for how to move forward with the strategic plan. It needs to be collaborative. It needs to be community-oriented. But it also needs to encompass more. This was teaching and learning, and I get that. That's our core business. Those are the tight pieces that we have to adhere to. But we should also have financial goals in our strategic plan. We should also have human resource goals in our strategic plan. And I think if we broaden our horizon a little bit, get our community involved, you've seen the work that we can do as an organization, and I have no doubt our community can do the same. It's going to take a while to get that done, but I think we need to start that process sooner rather than later. And if we can start to at least frame that process by the end of this calendar year, we can get something started over the winter with our community and move forward. So those are just my thoughts, but I'd be happy to hear from others.
Obviously, the strategic plan I've been very, very big on. I loved what I saw tonight with the special ed. I would like to see we do the teaching and learning plan as our overall big strategic plan, but we need to have a separate strategic plan for each citation, how we're going to handle that, just like with special ed, how that was done, a financial one, and then they can tie into this, but you got to be able to, because if you try to put it in one big one, it's hard to measure, but if you can do individualized ones that can kind of feed into one, that's more of a workable plan. Because then, obviously, like the special ed had pointed out tonight, that they have benchmarks in place. If this isn't working, then we can do coaching and do that. And I see us trying to do that for each citation with whoever the person is involved with those things, or whoever's been appointed that has to report on that and is in charge of that. But I see this as being the overall strategic plan of the district with the community input and everything like that. But I still think that we need to separate out the other things to have their own individualized plan, because they're different. And then that way we can, those are the key areas that we have to target and attack and get done, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. And I like that analysis, because if you take a look at our citations, there's a performance outcome that is the expectation. Well, how are we going to get to that outcome? And that's the plan that you're talking about. And that needs to be a component of every single one of the citations. We have that in terms of the framework. We just have to put it in a format that we can hold ourselves accountable on a timely basis and a monthly basis. And I think the document that the state is asking us to submit will help keep our feet to the fire, so to speak, in terms of keeping track of the plan of getting to that performance outcome that we know we need to hit by the end of the year, so that our goal is to get our accreditation back. And if we hit those outcomes, that's where we'll be.
And not only that, and then they see our plan. Every month when they meet, they see our plan right there, and they see we do have things built into place to measure successes, shortcomings, and what we're going to do to pivot and go a different direction and correct those things. I think that just from listening to them at their meetings, that's a huge thing that they're very, very very adamant on.
Well, and to be honest too, it's, what are we doing well and where are we coming up short? And that's what this document is going to help us with, as opposed to just talking in generalities.
So I was just going to say, yeah, I remember seeing this when I first became a board member, and I still haven't figured out exactly what Davenport Way is after all these years.
That was a street.
But I think it's great that we're finally sitting down to plan out some of this stuff. And I know you want to at least get the school year started. My thought is maybe kind of along the lines of what Dan was suggesting. We task some people with coming up with a strategic plan for finances or teaching and learning or whatever. In the meantime, board members to come up with, these are ones what they have in other districts. This is what they do here. These are things that we might, borrow from or something like that. Or if you have people who are interested in this, that way we can kind of come with some ideas when we come to this workshop together.
I think that's an excellent idea, and we can take the model that we just used with our return to learn plan, with our committees and subcommittees and board participation, and we see the power of a model like that, and we can certainly apply that to a strategic planning approach also.
Yeah, and I would encourage us to do that because we do have excellent people in the district, and when given the opportunity, they really rise to the occasion. But I know all of us also find it helpful, informative, and also feel like we can better do our job if we are part of those processes. Yeah, that's my 2 cents for now.
I'll explain Davenport Way to you. It's a combination of PBIS and Boys Town. And I won't give you my opinion on how I thought it was. Let's just say I retired once I hit that part. I have a question about this plan. 6th graders, it talks about them getting a grade. How are our 6th graders? Are we going to keep them on the EMN, or are we actually moving them to grades like they would have if they'd have gone to junior high? Elementary?
Yes.
You're sticking with the elementary system? Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I don't have to learn something new for this year.
I would point out to us that as we're talking about developing this strategic plan for the next 3, 4, 5, 7 years, I don't think we should get too hung up on tailoring this plan about us getting our accreditation back, because that has to happen this spring. And that should happen before we're even done creating this plan. So I think we need to keep in mind that we were developing a plan that's going to be in operation and being executed as many as 7 years from when we're done. And so the vision that we have to have and the vision that the people have to have involved in has to be long-term. Financially, yes, there's got to be a financial one, because long-term, we're going to have financial issues. But I think we need to keep that in our mind. That's what we're looking at, the long ball.
No, I agree completely that it would be nice to have the citations in the rearview mirror. But what I would say is there are elements of our citations, such as disproportionality in finance, that need to have a sustainable component, and I would suspect would be in a long-term strategic plan. So not as a separate appendage to it, but certainly it could guide our conversation moving forward, because what those citations list, as Amy Williamson described, are important functions of a school district and functions that need to be done well, and they would probably show up in our strategic plan anyway.
So to clarify, when I was talking, that's why I was kind of saying to have the strategic plans for the citations, but then have a strategic plan for the, I just wanted to clarify, because I didn't want you to think I meant that we were just trying to, and I think one other thing, and you talked about a little bit too, the SWOT analysis are huge, and Sandy and the special ed team did that because that's where they were able to find out where they had their strengths and weaknesses and what they needed to do. And I'd love to hear follow-up, halfway through the school year to see how that process is working, and maybe bring in some of the other teachers that are involved with that, and maybe, I don't know how it would work, but, or have like some of the parents come in, or have a special ed committee where they can kind of talk about that. 'Cause it sounded like we acknowledged the things that we did wrong, got a plan in place to correct them, and it's more of a free-flowing process now, to where they're able to curb things if they're getting sideways, and then they can come in and coach, and I did like that. So I wholeheartedly, you always have to have a SWOT analysis, because you have to know your strengths and weaknesses, because you're never going to be able to improve if you don't. But that's all I had. Thank you.
Anything else? Ken?
Karen, I don't know if you would agree with me as a new board member, but I never expected to be focusing on some of the things that we've had to focus on. And it seems like we're just constantly putting out fires. And so when we're talking about a strategic plan, this is, more what I thought we'd be focusing on. And so in my mind, the sooner the better. I know the superintendent's got a ton of things hanging over his head with the start of school, but I think the sooner we can get started. And I guess I would ask the superintendent to don't be afraid to give board members tasks to, follow up on this. I mean, I'd love to have something come from the superintendent and say, hey, these are some tasks I think the board should work on, and let's get started.
So perhaps at the end of the board meeting, after board requests, we could have administrative requests. Is that something?
Anything else? Linda?
I think I do agree with Kent with that. I know we're responsible for policies and finances, but right now with the crisis we're in, we're a team, and I think wherever we can spread resources and help, that would be a great thing to do.
It's all hands on deck, right?
All hands on deck.
Anything else? Anything else? We're adjourned.